September 3, 1982, Sunnyvale, California. A 15-year-old girl named Karen Stitt stepped off a city bus at the corner of El Camino Real and Remington Drive. She never made it home. Her body was found behind a wall, just steps from the street, stripped, bound with her own jacket, stabbed 59 times, and for the next 4 decades, nothing. No arrests, no answers. This is Case Files Explained, and this is the story of the detective who refused to let time win. Detective Matt Hutchison of the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety has a reputation. Colleagues call him a badass, and not because of bravado. Because of results. 7 cold cases, 7 identifications, murders that had gone unsolved for 20, 30, even 40 years. Hutchison cracked them all. Today, we're going to focus on 2 of them. 2 teenage girls, killed 3 years apart, by 2 different men, both of whom walked free. Until they didn't. To understand how these cases were finally solved, you need to understand what forensic genetic genealogy actually is, and it starts with something that happened in 2018. That's when investigators identified the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer who'd terrorized California for over a decade. They did it by uploading crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database. The database matched the DNA to distant relatives. From there, investigators built family trees, narrowed the pool, and eventually landed on one man who matched. This technique, forensic investigative genetic genealogy, has since revolutionized cold case work, and Detective Hutchison became one of its most effective practitioners. Karen Stitt was 15 years old on the night she died. September 3, 1982. She'd been visiting her sister and was heading home when she got off that bus in Sunnyvale. A passerby found her body behind a small retaining wall, just steps from the bus stop. She'd been sexually assaulted and stabbed 59 times. Her clothing had been removed, her hands were bound with her own jacket. The brutality of the attack suggested a killer who'd acted with extreme violence and then vanished. Investigators collected what evidence they could. But in 1982, DNA technology was still in its infancy. There was no database. No genetic fingerprinting. Just old-fashioned legwork, and a case that went cold. For the next 35 years, Karen's case sat in a box. Her family waited. And waited. The man who killed her walked free, lived his life while they had no answers. Then, in 2017, Detective Matt Hutchison picked up the file. He'd been assigned to cold cases, and Karen's was one that haunted him. He sent the preserved biological evidence for DNA analysis, got a profile, then submitted it to a forensic genealogy lab for investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. By early 2019, the genealogy work came back with a lead. The DNA matched relatives of a family from Fresno, California. 4 brothers, any of whom could have been the killer. Hutchison's next move was textbook detective work, but it required patience. He tracked down a daughter of one of the brothers. She lived in Southern California, hundreds of miles from Sunnyvale. And then he waited. Watched. Collected her discarded trash. This technique, called a trash pull, is perfectly legal. Once you put garbage on the curb, you've abandoned your expectation of privacy. From that trash, Hutchison obtained DNA, sent it to the lab, and got the confirmation he needed. The genetic profile was consistent with being the daughter of Karen Stitt's killer. Her father's name was Gary Ramirez. He was 76 years old. And he was living in Hawaii, enjoying retirement on the Big Island, far from California, far from accountability. In April 2022, 40 years after Karen Stitt was murdered, Detective Hutchison flew to Hawaii. He knocked on Ramirez's door. And he made the arrest. Ramirez was extradited to California to face charges of first-degree murder. He initially pleaded not guilty, but the DNA evidence was overwhelming. In 2025, at age 78, Gary Ramirez changed his plea. No contest to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, the maximum possible for his age. For Karen's family, who'd waited over 4 decades without answers, it was a moment 42 years in the making. For 40 years, I wondered who did this to my daughter, one family member said. Now I know. But Karen Stitt wasn't the only case Hutchison cracked. 3 years before Karen died, in 1979, another young woman was killed in Sunnyvale. Her name was Estella Mena. Estella was 18 years old. She worked as a security guard at an office building, the night shift. On February 13, 1979, she reported to work like any other night. She never clocked out. Her body was found the next morning, in a corner of the building, next to a vending machine. She'd been stabbed multiple times. The killer left almost nothing behind. Almost. What investigators did find and preserve was blood on Estella's shoe, not her blood, someone else's. The killer had cut himself during the attack. In 1979, that blood was just evidence, unidentifiable, untraceable. The case went cold, and stayed cold for over 4 decades while Estella's killer continued living his life. When Hutchison took on Estella's case, he applied the same playbook. Get the preserved evidence, extract the DNA, run it through forensic genealogy databases, build a family tree. In 2023, the results came back with a name, Samuel Silva. And unlike Gary Ramirez, Samuel Silva would never face a courtroom. Silva had a long criminal history, arrests for manslaughter, attempted murder, rape, and assault. He was exactly the kind of violent offender who kills and keeps killing. But here's the thing. Samuel Silva died in 2008. He was serving time in a Colorado prison when he passed away, years before anyone ever connected him to Estella Mena. He'd been in and out of prison for decades, violent crime after violent crime, and he died behind bars without ever being held accountable for taking Estella's life. You might ask, what's the point? If the killer is already dead, what does identification accomplish? It's a fair question, and the answer is complicated. For Estella's family, knowing who killed her, even if he's beyond earthly justice, provides closure. It ends decades of wondering, of suspecting neighbors, of never knowing. And there's another reason. When investigators identify a serial offender like Silva, they can potentially connect him to other unsolved cases. His DNA is now in the system, forever. Detective Hutchison's approach to cold cases follows a methodical pattern. It's not glamorous, it's not fast. But it works. First, he re-examines the original case file, everything. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every lead that went nowhere. He's looking for what the original investigators might have missed or couldn't have known. Then, this is crucial, he locates the preserved biological evidence. Not every case still has it, evidence gets lost. Mishandled. Destroyed, but when it survives, that's when the real work begins. He sends it to specialized labs for DNA extraction and profiling. If there's enough genetic material, and if it hasn't degraded too badly, they can build a full profile. That profile goes to genealogy databases. From there, genealogists build family trees. They work backward and forward through generations, marriages, births, deaths, migrations, until they narrow the pool to a handful of possible suspects. And then comes the old-school detective work, surveillance, trash pulls, confirming alibis and locations. Hutchison does this part himself, because the final identification has to be bulletproof for court. If you're following true crime, you've probably heard about consumer DNA testing, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, companies like that. Here's what you might want to consider about how that data can be used. When you submit your DNA to these services, you're not just sharing your own genetic information, you're also providing data that can identify your relatives, including relatives you've never met. That's exactly how Hutchison's cases were solved. The killers hadn't submitted their own DNA. But their relatives had, and that was enough to build a family tree that led investigators right to them. Some people see this as an invasion of privacy. Others see it as justice finally catching up with violent offenders. It's worth thinking about where you stand before you swab that cheek. If you're interested in cold case investigations, consider looking into organizations that support this work. Groups like the DNA Doe Project identify unknown victims using the same genealogy techniques. Local law enforcement agencies often have cold case units that are understaffed and underfunded. Community advocacy can push for the resources these investigators need to pursue cases that have been forgotten. And if you've got information about an unsolved case, even something that seems minor, it might be worth reaching out to investigators. Tips that seemed irrelevant 40 years ago might be exactly what's needed to break a case today. Hutchison himself puts it simply. When asked about his persistence, he told ABC News, "I don't give up. These victims deserve someone who won't give up." Karen Stitt was 15, a kid with her whole life ahead of her. She got off a bus one evening and ran into a monster. For 40 years, that monster had a name only he knew. Now the world knows it too. Gary Ramirez, 78 years old, serving 25 to life in California State Prison for what he did to a girl who'd barely started living. Estella Mena was 18, working a night shift, trying to build a life. Samuel Silva took that from her and walked away for almost 3 decades before anyone knew. He died without ever being confronted with what he did, but now his name is attached to it, forever. In police databases, in public records, in this podcast. If you found this breakdown helpful, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. We cover cases like this every week, the investigations, the evidence, the outcomes. No sensationalism, just the story. What Hutchison represents is something rare in law enforcement, a refusal to let time win. Cold cases are cold because they're hard, because the evidence has degraded, because witnesses have died or disappeared. But technology has changed the equation. Forensic genealogy has given investigators a new weapon, one that can reach across decades and identify people who thought they'd gotten away with murder. It doesn't work in every case. DNA degrades, evidence gets lost. Some killers simply won't be in any database, no matter how many relatives submit samples. But for families like Karen Stitt's and Estella Mena's, when it does work, it matters. 40 years of silence replaced by a name. By accountability. By something resembling closure. Detective Matt Hutchison is still working cases. Still refusing to give up on victims that others have forgotten. His badge reads Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety. But his real job is speaking for the dead. Karen Stitt, Estella Mena. 2 teenagers. 2 separate killers. 2 cases that went cold for over 40 years. And 1 detective who brought them answers. This has been Case Files Explained. Until next time.